Okay, we started chapter 12 yesterday, like an intro with the whole jelly blubber situation, right? So we talked about how you want to, randomize your samples. You want to have a good sample size of the population, all that jazz, right? You want to be representative of the population, yada, yada. All right, so the first thing I want to go through today is, so again, pretty much all today's vocabulary, but the first thing I want to talk about is population parameters and sample statistics, okay? So far, everything we've done in this class, anytime we do any sort of measurement, we have some sort of statistic. So a statistic so far in this class has been like when we found the mean. Like yesterday, you found the mean length of the jelly blubber, so that was a statistic, all right? With each statistic we talk about, there is always an associated population parameter, all right? So for example, if I was going to ask every senior in high school in Kentucky their height, I wanted to know the average height, right? We talked about yesterday that it would pretty much be impossible for me to actually survey everybody, right? That wouldn't be feasible, or even if it was feasible, it probably wouldn't happen, right? Just there's too much movement and things like that. So at the end, we would probably just take a sample, and so we would get a sample we get of a mean height, the very sample statistic. To go with that, though, we would have a population mean that we don't know necessarily. So the parameter is just what we're thinking about, like when we're generalizing, like we're going from our sample height, we want to talk about the population height. We probably won't actually know what that is, though, because there's so many people, right? We have different sets of symbols we use to be used for a statistic versus a parameter. And there's a list at the bottom I'll show you in a second. But for example, for the mean, we would use x bar to be the mean for our sample, and that's associated with mu, like the Greek letter mu, which would be the population mean. And we probably won't actually know what that is. Yesterday with the jelly blubbers, you guys did 10 jelly blubbers, and that was your sample mean. And then the entire population of jelly blubbers was on the page. So we could go through, we could find the population mean because there was only 100 of them. And so the population parameter would have been the average for all of them, okay? So you have a parameter is just a fancy word for saying the measurement for the entire whole, and statistic is the measurement for your sample, okay? So here are some common ones. What means bar and mu. You don't have to write all these down. We'll use a bunch of these after Christmas when we start doing certain tests and things. You'll definitely know the difference between population and statistic. So then we have standard deviation. We use S. But then for the parameter for the entire population, we use a lowercase sigma. You don't need to know these right now. And then another popular one is proportion. So p hat would be a proportion for a sample because it's an estimate of the population. And then just the lowercase p would be for the entire population, all right? So again, we are going to have a measurement for your sample, and then we're going to generalize that to some sort of population where we probably don't know the actual measurement, okay? So that's what the difference between parameter and statistic is. Questions about those two words, parameter and statistic? Another way to think about it is a statistic is something you can actually measure, and the parameter is something you probably can't actually measure. Okay? All right, that'll come up later in the homework. All right, there were 4 types of sampling you read about last night. So here's the rundown. Simple random samples are just that. They involve like 0 extra effort. You get a roster of people, you pick 20 people from the roster using a random number generator. Done. For the jelly blubbers yesterday, that's what we did. We did a simple random sample. You had 100 jelly blubbers, and you picked 10 numbers, and those are the ones you measured, right? So a simple random sample is that. It is simple. There is no extra step to it. You just select a random group of people. Random 50, random 25, random 30, whatever you're doing, okay? I'm going to use the same example for all 4 types today. So here's my example that I'm going to use to generalize. Let's say I'm doing a survey at school. Okay? We'll say there's approximately 400 people at Murray High School, students-wise. So I would get a roster of the entire school, number them 1 to 400, and then choose 75 of them. And I would go and ask my questions to those 75 people using a random number generator. Everyone's clear about what a simple random sample is? Okay. You would just assign numbers, but then you randomly generate which ones you're going to talk to. Okay. Stratified sample. A strata is just a group. This is why I'm using school. Easy way to have groups. You talk about their classes. Freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. Right? 4 groups. A stratified sample means I take the roster from each strata, each group, and I select 25 from each group. All right? That's what a stratified sample is. So I would take all the freshmen, number them 1 to 100, and then randomly generate 25 of them. And then same thing for sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So my stratified sample will be rather representative because I ensure that I have people from each group. Does that make sense? Yeah. In a simple random sample, you can't ensure that you're going to have people from each group. If I have 400 people at school and I pick 75, it could happen that they're all seniors. Or it could happen they're all seniors and freshmen. You don't know. All right? It's a valid sampling strategy. But depending on what kind of opinions you want, you may or may not get what you're actually looking for. So stratified ensures that you get opinions from each group. Does that make sense? Cluster sampling sounds similar because it's also based on groups. But cluster samples, that means that you take the groups and you number the groups, and then you select a group or groups and do a census of that group. So at school, I would take freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, number them 1, 2, 3, 4, randomly generate a number, and so let's say I get 2, and that represents sophomores. Well, then I would survey every single sophomore. So I'm only surveying a specific group. All right? So stratified and cluster, yes, are both based on groups. Stratified, you get people from each group. Cluster, you pick a specific group or groups. Does that make sense? So stratified are picking 25 from each grade. Cluster are picking a grade. Cluster tends to not be used very often because normally that leads to leaving people out of your sample. So there's just like random scenarios where maybe that is what is necessary. Multi-stage is on here, but multi-stage is a fancy way of saying you put multiple methods together. Like you did a 2 or 3 step survey, and so maybe you did a simple random sample, but then once you did that, you split them into groups and you did a stratified sample. It's like multi-process survey. Okay? And then systematic is the easy one because systematic, it means like it's like you did it systematically at some point, like you used some sort of pattern. So you took the school roster and you picked every 25th person on the school roster. That wouldn't be very many people, but you pick every 25th person. Or you're on the school roster and you pick every person. Now again, that can't ensure that you get everyone from like a grade in school, right? Because if it's an alphabetical order, well then you can't ensure that every 4th person is going to represent freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, right? So using that whole school example, sampling method, simple random, systematic, cluster, or stratified, which one would have the most representative sample? Stratified, right? Because you would have to ensure an opinion from each group. So when you're talking about sampling variability, we talked about that yesterday, or sampling error, but sampling error sounds bad, right? So sampling variability we talked about yesterday was just the difference from sample to sample. So we did the jelly blubbers, and when we did that, we did our simple random samples, it was more spread out than when you chose your representative sample, right? And it was because it's just random, right? So you might get more small baby jelly blubbers or some bigger ones out, but you ensure that it was random. Well, if you want to narrow that sampling variability, right, then you want to make sure it's more representative of everybody. So if you want to have a reduced sampling variability, which method would you use? Stratified. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions about the sampling types and sampling variability? And sampling variability isn't a bad thing. It just exists. It's just going to be there. Always. All right. Then the next part of this is you are going to design a survey. All right, that's where we're going to shift in gears. There's all the methods you can use to do the survey, but here you are designing. At the end of chapter 13, I will give to you for a class project, as a group project. You can pick your groups, whatever. And you can either choose to do something based on concepts from chapter 12 or something based on concepts from chapter 13. So if you did chapter 12, you'd be doing some sort of survey project. So it seems like writing a survey is super easy, but there's a lot of thought that goes into making a survey. All right, so some more vocabulary for you. First of all, you want to define the who. Okay? So you have an ideal population in your head. All right, so let's say that I want to sample everybody at Murray High School. That's what I've been talking about today. So that's my population, is Murray High School students. Okay? The sampling frame then is a list of individuals that I draw my sample from. So that might be different than the population. This is why. At Murray High School, let's say I ask the guidance office for the roster, all right, like a week before school starts. Okay? Well, then obviously I'm not doing a survey so people get here. After school starts, we always have craziness. People like are transferring or they moved away that we didn't know about. You know, like there's just lots of movement there, all right? So your sampling frame and your population would have been different in that case then, right? Your population would have been all Murray High School students, but the sampling frame would have been the list that you had from before all that stuff changed. Does that make sense? So your sampling frame is who you actually had access to on a list. Okay? Then the intended target sample. All right? So your population idea, you got your sampling frame, then let's say we did a simple random sample, we picked 50 people at school. All right? Again, that sampling frame was before school started and may not be, let's say out of that 50 people, 2 of them didn't even come to school this year, like they were transferred or moved away. All right? So they were chosen for your sample, so they were part of your target sample, but you can't survey them because they're not here, right? And then maybe 2 of them are absent that day you're doing the survey, okay? So your actual sample might also be a little bit different than your target sample. Does that make sense? Okay, so you just have to think through all those things. You're never going to get maybe exactly who you wanted to talk to. You'll get close, but you might not get exactly all 50 that you had intended to. You might not have a sampling frame that exactly matches up with your population. Right, if I was going to do, again, like ask a question to all seniors at all seniors in Kentucky high schools. I could ask the state, I'm sure, for a list of seniors, but list of seniors is going to change daily because of people moving in and out and stuff happening. Maybe I can only probably access public schools, so maybe they move to a private school. Stuff happens, right? So my sampling frame is always going to be a little bit different than the population. Okay? Yes? All right. Then once you're done the survey, there's lots of questions you have to ask. What do you want to know? That's, I know, but what do you really want to know with the survey? Because what happens is you write a survey, and then afterwards you're doing the results, and you're looking at them, and you're like, I wish I had asked this to go along with these questions. You know what you're like intending to like get, like what information you're intending to get out of people. Okay? Like for example, let's just say, I don't know. Well then afterwards, like, man, I wish I knew if these were juniors or seniors. The junior group and the senior group. You can't ask afterwards. So make sure you know what information you actually want. Am I asking the right respondent? So you're asking. If you want to know about AP classes, you're not going to ask. Well, I guess they're taking one now, right? But they're taking singular. I think they're taking one. No, they're not. Never mind. I lied. Scratch that. So you're not going to ask freshmen and sophomores. They don't take AP classes. That doesn't help you. That will give you 0 result. Your survey will be returned to you that's blank, right? Because they don't take AP classes. Also, freshmen and sophomores don't know their GPA. They got no clue. I'm just telling you that up front. Okay? So be careful that you're asking the right people. Am I asking the right questions? Again, am I asking what I really want to ask? Also, am I asking an appropriate question? We'll talk about that more in a second. What would I do with the answers if I had them? Would they address the things I want to know? Don't ask these super complex, open-ended questions and then expect people to do something with that. It's not going to work, all right? So you want to try to get quantitative results. If you can't get quantitative results, you want categorical results. You don't want something like so here are some other things we should look at. Tune your instrument. That's okay. You've written your survey, all right? It looks good to you. All right, so maybe Jay and we're doing this together, and they wrote this survey, and they were like, "It looks good to me, man. Looks good to me too." Well, then they give it to Peyton, and Peyton's like, "This doesn't make any sense." Okay, so you want to make sure that you've asked other people outside public. All right. We call that a pilot of your survey. You want to make sure that it's legit and like sounds good before you're just like, yeah, okay, it's fine. Rather than general questions, you want to be as specific as possible. Do not ask general open-ended questions. Don't do it. All right? I will tell you from years past with this survey project / experiment project, survey results are always entertaining at Murray High School. So if you were going to ask about extracurricular activities, all right, I would not say, what activities are you involved in? First of all, it doesn't indicate you're interested in just activities at Murray High School. Second, depending on what season or what activities they're currently doing at that very moment, probably that's what's going to end up on the paper and not what all they're involved in, all right? So don't leave it up to them. Give them choices. So if you're going to ask what extracurricular activities you're involved in, you better provide an extensive list and then say select all that apply, okay? You want to not give people leeway to mess up your results, okay? If you ask people their GPA and you say you want the unweighted GPA, half people in the school do not know what unweighted means. All right. If you ask people their ACT score, I guarantee you that the senior class will come up having at least 1536s because people lie. All right. So just make sure that you understand that you're going to get responses that necessarily aren't true, and make sure that you give very specific. Like some people don't get the ACT, so they write like they got a 100 on the ACT because they don't know what it is or something. I don't know. So give them maybe a choice. If you can give them choices or give them a very specific question they have to answer, it's always better. Ask for quantitative results. Again, you can do more with quantitative, like you can do more with numbers than you can with a category. Be careful in phrasing your questions. If you try to make it sound all super academic, you guys are all smart individuals, and that's awesome. But then if you give this survey to the general population at Murray High School, they are not all super smart individuals, and they'll be like, what does this word mean? So you need to make sure that you phrase your questions appropriately. Also, you don't want to word your questions in such a way that you make people lean towards responding a certain way. Right? For example, if you ask about patriotism, everyone generally is going to be like, woo America, if you ask a specific way. All right? You have to be like general, like enough that you don't like lean people in a certain direction. You don't phrase it in such a way that like it's like, I hate you if you say this answer, okay? You have to make sure that you're very good about writing your question. All right, so there is a lot that goes into writing a survey. Just know that. You should be very, very thoughtful about what you're writing. Very thoughtful about who you're going to give this survey to. Again, I'm telling you, you're going to get silly responses from freshmen and sophomores about their GPA. They do not know. They don't. They have no clue. All right? So just think about who you're asking it to and what information they actually know. Like, you guys know your GPA because you're about college and stuff. Juniors know their GPA because they're starting to worry about keys money and stuff, even though you should be worried when you're a freshman. But the freshmen and sophomores literally have no clue what their GPA is. They could care less because they have no clue. Freshmen don't have one right now yet anyway. Like, if you ask GPA, they have a rolling one, but they don't have like a end of the school year GPA that counts on like on a transcript somewhere. Like, they don't have that. So be careful about who you decide to ask the survey. You maybe need to narrow who you're asking it to. Like, in that case, you wouldn't want to do a stratified sample of the entire school because they don't know. Okay? Just be very careful. So with all that, you write a survey. You decide how you're going to do the sample. Well, you have to be careful that you don't incorporate any bias. So now I got a list of biases to tell you about. All right. First one, if you do a voluntary response sample, you are encouraging voluntary response bias. Here is voluntary response samples. You're watching the news. It's election season, right? You're watching the news and like, call this number if you have an opinion about this. Or tweet hashtag Trump or hashtag Carson or whatever about who you're going to vote for. Okay? First of all, you have to be watching the TV at that very moment. Second of all, they're not forcing you to do it, like it's not actually in front of you. You have to actually be not lazy enough to call a number and talk to somebody or get on Twitter and really want to tweet out with a hashtag for it to really matter, right? So what happens is with these voluntary response type surveys, you only get the people that have very strong opinions about things because they care enough to pick up the phone and call in to the talk show, right? Or they care enough that they're going to blast out who they're going to vote for and why on Twitter, all right? So it ends up being these people with strong opinions and not people that have mediocre opinion or are undecided or whatever. Like if it said hashtag Trump, hashtag Carson, hashtag undecided, it's going to look like no one's undecided because if you're undecided, you don't care. You're not going to tweet about it. I'm just saying, like that's just what's going to happen, all right? So it's going to look like everyone's like, oh, Trump, Carson, da-da-da, and that no one has no clue what they're talking about because they haven't tweeted. They don't care, all right? So voluntary response is bad because you're encouraging people with strong opinions instead of like everyone's opinion. Does that make sense? Okay. Convenient sampling is awesome in theory, but terrible in practice. Convenient sampling means like you sample people that are convenient to you. Like you're going to do the survey and you're like, you know what, I'm just going to sit down at my cafeteria table and ask everyone at my table. That's convenient to you, but that's a dumb way to get survey results. Because now you just have your friends at your cafeteria table, which is probably not a representative sample of the entire school building. Okay? So convenient sampling, not so awesome. Those internet surveys are convenient samples. They pop up because you're visiting their website. You're not going to answer those. When do you answer a survey on the internet? When it's about customer service or something and you had a terrible experience. That's when you answer those. Otherwise, you don't care, right? That goes back to voluntary response, right? Oh my gosh. Under coverage. Now, our book has this top part. I think our book gives a terrible definition, so I use a different book. All right, so what I haven't typed up is what's good. Undercoverage occurs when some groups in the population are left out of the process of choosing the sample. I've got a perfect example for this. A lot of polling agencies that exist still use their sampling frame as landline telephone numbers. A lot of people don't have landlines anymore. That's just true fact, right? They just don't have landlines anymore. So what happens is when they go to select their sample, they want to poll the entire population of everybody in the United States. Well, their sampling frame is only people with landlines. They're leaving out everyone that's on a landline before they even started picking their sample, right? That's undercoverage. They have left out people before they even started, okay? Like you leave out people when you're picking a sample. That's just going to happen, right? You're not picking everybody. But here they're leaving out an entire group of people because they don't have a landline. They only have cell phones. That's undercoverage. Non-response bias. Again, our book does a terrible job. Non-response bias is when you have selected your sample. So I have selected 25 seniors to talk to. And out of those 25 seniors, people say they don't want to respond because they can say that. You're not going to beat them up and make you answer their questions. Because you can't do that's illegal. So it's bullying and stuff. You can't do that. So out of the 25 people I've selected, maybe people refuse to participate, or maybe they are like on vacation or something, and you can't contact them. You can't get a hold of them. So non-response bias is when you have already selected your sample. You already know who you're going to ask, and then you can't get a hold of those people that you're going to ask. Does that make sense? Of course, if there's non-response bias, there has to be response bias as well. Response bias is any time you do anything to influence the responses to the survey. Wording of the question or the answers. If you word it in such a way that it makes someone answer a specific way, that is response bias. Okay? If like you're talking about, if you're doing a polling question about Democrats and Republicans, if you word it in such a way that it obviously shows that you are a Republican and you are a very like opinionated Republican, then and it asks about what party you are, they're not going to say they're a Democrat if you're standing right there. Because obviously you have very strong opinions and they don't want to get in an argument. I'm just saying. That's response bias. Response bias could also be just your demeanor. You're giving the survey, so you're sitting right next to this person, and maybe you're being super weird. I don't know. If you influence them in any way, so like maybe they're like they're trying to answer your questions as soon as possible so they can get away from you. They're not thinking about their responses and they're just spouting out things. Okay, that is the way that you're influencing. Okay. But with response bias. Yeah. Yeah. Generally, it's better to get the survey anonymously. Like if you have 25 people selected, then put their name on it and have someone else give it to them or whatever, like a teacher or whatever. You don't want to be the one that, because if maybe you have a going on. I don't know. But that's not going to be good news for your survey. Okay? Questions about any of these types of bias? I know there's a lot of them. That's why I said in chapter 12, it's just a lot of definitions. All right. So I'm going to do the next 15 minutes. Like I said, I'm just going to do examples. And so tomorrow we'll come in and we'll do some practice and work through this, work through the examples in the chapter, etc. Okay, so I'm just going to do some examples. Okay. Through their Roper reports worldwide, GfK Roper conducts a global consumer survey to help multinational companies understand different consumer attitudes throughout the world. Within 30 countries, the researchers interview 1,000 people aged 13 to 65. Their samples are designed so they get 500 males and 500 females in each country. Are they using a simple random sample? No. Why not? Right. They're getting 500 females and 500 males in each country. So that ensures that you're getting so many of one group of another group. So that's not a simple random sample. Stratified. Because they gender and they've selected so many from one group and so many from another. And they're going to do that in all 30 countries. Questions about that? A local TV station conducted a pulse poll about the upcoming mayoral election. Evening news viewers were invited to phone in their votes, with the results to be announced on the late night news. Based on the phone calls, the station predicted that Amabo would win the election with 52% of the vote. They were wrong. Amabo lost, getting only 46% of the vote. Do you think the station's faulty prediction is more likely to be a result of bias or sampling error? Bias. Right. First of all, you have to be watching the evening news. And how many of you guys actually watch the evening news? Yeah, exactly. So you're not watching the evening news. Then that means you probably actually went out and voted and like really cared. If you watched the evening news and you didn't care, you're not calling in. Okay, so there you go. Probably due to bias. Now, if it was like a actually good sampling strategy and they were wrong, that'd been due to sampling error, right? Because every sample is different. But this was not a sound sampling strategy. In a large city school system with 20 elementary schools, the school board is considering the adoption of a new policy that would require elementary students to pass a test in order to be promoted to the next grade. The PTA wants to find out whether parents agree with this plan. Listed below are some of the ideas proposed for gathering data. For each, indicate what kind of sampling strategy is involved and what, if any, biases might result. A. Put a big ad in the newspaper asking people to log their opinions onto the PTA website. That's bias. What kind of bias is it? Voluntary response bias. And so it asks what kind of sampling strategy. That's the sampling strategy as well. It's voluntary response sampling, which leads to voluntary response bias. Right? It's in the newspaper. Not many people are getting the newspaper anymore. Then once you get the newspaper, look at the ad. Once you look at the ad, it says you have to log on to a website. Right? So I'm just saying you're going to be pretty strong opinions if you're going to log into this website. Randomly select one of the elementary schools and contact every parent by phone. What kind of sampling strategy is that? Cluster. Because you pick one and do a census, right? Now, what kind of bias might this introduce? Maybe non-response. This one is probably undercoverage, though. Well, because I say undercoverage because you have 20 elementary schools and you're picking one, right? So is this the Genius Magnet School that has like whiz kids? Because if so, their parents are like, whatever, they can take all the dust they want, all right? Or is it maybe an underprivileged school, right, where maybe you have kids that are struggling, need extra help, you know? So it would depend on what school it is. So I would say more so undercoverage because they're leaving out, like in the sample design, they're going to leave out like specific opinions, right? C, send a survey home with every student and ask parents to fill it out and return it the next day. What kind of sampling strategy is that? If you send it home with every student. Census. And then what kind of bias might you get? Non-response, right? In this case, you're sending a survey home with a kindergartner, you know, fourth grader, which means the parent then has to get out of the homework folder or whatever. Then they got to answer it and put it back in the homework folder. Like, is that honestly going to happen by the next day? Probably not. Okay? So you're probably going to have non-response because they just don't turn it back in. On D, randomly select 20 parents from each elementary school, send them a survey, and follow up with a phone call if they do not return the survey within a week. So what kind of sampling strategy is that? Stratified. They pick 20 parents from each school, right? So every school is represented, right? This seems like a sound sampling strategy too, right? They're sending 20 kids a survey. If they don't return it, they're going to follow up with a phone call, right? So I think you've eliminated pretty much all the possible bias, right? You have a bunch of different opinions represented. You're going to try to get as many responses as possible. You're always going to have people that don't respond, right? But this is like less like voluntary. They're going to like follow up and like ask you, make sure that they get as many responses as they can, right? Questions about that one? There's always could be the potential for bias, but I think they've eliminated most of the potential there because of their design. Wording. 2 members of the PTA committee in exercise 17 have proposed different questions to ask in seeking parents' opinions. Question 1. Should elementary school age children have to pass high stakes tests in order to remain with their classmates? Question 2. Should schools and students be held accountable for meeting yearly learning goals by testing students before they advance to the next grade? Do you think responses to these 2 questions might differ? How and what kind of bias is this? First of all, what kind of bias is going to be present? Response, because of the wording of the question. So let's talk about the question. Question 1. It says high stakes, so we got educational jargon. Then it says, in order to remain with their classmates. That is going to pull on the heartstrings of every parent everywhere. They're going to be like, what? What do you mean they can't stay with their classmates? All right, then you're going to have parents up in arms. No, it just says remain with their classmates. So, exactly. So you're going to get all the moms going, but no, but they're classmates. Oh my gosh. Okay, so question 2 says, should schools and students be held accountable for meeting yearly learning goals by testing students before they advance to the next grade? But nowhere does it say they're going to be held back. Right? It just says, should students be held accountable? by giving a test before they advance to the next grade? Well, some parents probably be like, yeah, they should take a test. They shouldn't be able to be accountable for what they know. But it doesn't say in that question they're going to be held back if they don't pass the test. Right? So they're going to have more people agreeing on question 2, more people disagreeing with question 1. Does that make sense? The response bias in both questions. So part B says propose a different question. Why can't we just say the school board is considering the adoption of a new policy that would require elementary students to pass a test in order to be promoted to the next grade? Do you agree or disagree? What's wrong with that? You want to be straightforward and give them the spiel, right? You don't want to have to like word it in such a way that everyone's confused and you're swaying them in a specific opinion. Okay. Okay, one more. For the following reports about statistical studies, identify the following items. If you can, if you can't, then it's fine because you can't tell everything about a survey. Consumers Union asked all subscribers whether they had used alternative medical treatments, and if so, whether they had benefited from them. For almost all of the treatments, approximately 20% of those responding reported cures or substantial improvement in their condition. So it wants to identify the population. In this case, the population is probably all adults. Right? They're probably trying to generalize to everybody that they can. Skip to C, the sampling frame. They can only, though, Consumers Union can only ask their subscribers, right? That's who they have access to. So even though the population is all adults, the sampling frame is going to be the specific set of subscribers they have. Does that make sense? The sample, we don't really know who they sampled. It doesn't tell us how many people they responded. They didn't tell any of that. So I have no idea who the sample is. Couldn't tell you. Okay? The sampling method, it seems like they did a census of all their subscribers. Right? Because they said they asked all subscribers. And then, so if it was a census, there was no randomization. Right? And then, let's see here. This is just what's being measured. Like, what type of measurement are they taking? So in this case, they have 20% responded such and such. That means they were interested in a proportion of people. That's a measurement. What proportion did this? And then any potential sources of bias. Since they're giving a census, it's hard to have bias, except I don't know necessarily what Consumers Union is. So maybe I need to do some research into what type of organization that is to see how that relates, if it all relates to alternative medical treatment. Right, because I don't know. That might be my source of bias there. You might also have non-response bias. They didn't tell us who all was in the sample, and they did a census, so I doubt everyone responded. Okay? So tomorrow, a lot of the questions you're going to be doing are like this, where you're analyzing a scenario. Any questions?